Okay, let's get into this. Well, looks like the Russians are doing some drills, basically using SU-30, SU-24s. I can imagine probably SU-34s and TU-22s. Basically staging simulated attacks on NATO shipping in the Baltic Sea. Or not the Baltic Sea, in the Black Sea. So the thing is that even though NATO isn't in the Black Sea, but the thing is, or are they? Yeah, they are. But anyway, sorry, I'm kind of Friday, kind of all over the map here. But anyway, they're doing this training drills. And I don't know why NATO gets so offended when they do this, considering all the drills that NATO does to counter Russian stuff. So the thing is that this is kind of again going back to something that actually one of my commenters made about the RAF with the Typhoons and being used in conjunction with warships. I forget which warship the British have. Basically, a destroyer. Almost the same kind of role Canada would use our destroyers in. Our aircraft destroyers uh, and ship destroyers, basically the Iroquois. We only have the 3 tribal class destroyers left, but only one is in the Athabascan is the only one that I know of that's in service. And it has basically air defense systems on it that if you had basically the Aurora CP-140 flying basically sub-hunter electronic warfare type of thing flying around, above that you would have the CF-18s circling to protect the Auroras. The Auroras would also help to protect the CF-18s by jamming radar signals and stuff like that. And of course the surface group would be down there with the Kingston class doing mine sweeping and basically look sub-hunting. And then of course you'd have the frigates, which also would be sub-hunting, the Halifax class, and then the destroyer class, which would be doing all those things as well as more emphasis on air defense. So it's to be used as a group. Now the Russians know this, and this is pretty much what a British citizen, pretty much one of my commenters described to me what the RAF would do with the British Typhoon would fly cap and then protecting the destroyers, and they would pretty much use the same tactics as Canada in that sense. Most people do, militaries do, and plus you'd have your submarines below the surface on top of that. So everybody's kind of working together as one unit. So the thing is one thing the Russians have is they have 2 types of aircraft that really kind of come into play when we're talking about anti-shipping: the Su-22M and the Su-34. These are aircrafts that are pretty much designed specifically to be ready to take out aircraft carriers, surface groups, that type of thing. It's not the only things they have. The reason why they'd use those is that, number one, the Tu-22s are a mid-weight bomber, basically similar to that of what would be the U.S. equivalent. Maybe not quite as powerful as the B-1 Lancer, but in that kind of territory. Heavy payload, cruise missiles, that type of thing. And remember, with the cruise missile technology out there, you don't have to get right above the ship to bomb it. These things might be firing sea skimming missiles as far as 100 miles out. That's considered close range, right? So when you have a Tu-22 coming in over Mach 2, 20 feet off the 20 feet wet, I mean, that's going to be a really hard aircraft to stop. And if there's multiple of them coming at different angles, look at the Russians are probably looking at it like this. Yes, there's a good chance that the surface group will shoot down all Tu-22Ms and Su-34s. But if one gets through, one cruise missile gets through, that's all it takes. You destroy 300 to 500 people in a big fireball. And if you take out a destroyer, then your nation that you're attacking has lost a major defensive asset. So that's why destroyers and aircraft carriers, which I think, this is going to be a bold statement, but they are becoming slightly obsolete. And here's why. Because the Russians have Mach 10, Mach 7, and Mach 10 anti-shipping missiles, which, believe it or not, most of them probably can be intercepted and shot down and countermeasured against. But it's a one-hit wonder. The Russians will launch basically from their Nunchukas or some of their other cruisers or whatever they have. They'll or even the Oscar-class submarines, they could basically fire 24 missiles at a time. Only one has to get through. And if one gets through, again, after that, uh, losing that kind of an air defense capability, you're then reliant on fighters, pretty much, and the ground defense radar. So basically, your early warning system out in the ocean somewhere, or in the Baltic Sea, or in the the Black Sea, or wherever you're going to be, uh, is basically going to be easy ground to cover for Russian probing submarines. The Yassin class submarine is a attack submarine that the Russians have recently commissioned. I think they're going to put out 6 of these suckers, and these things are extravagantly. These things are claimed to do 40 knots underwater. It'll be the fastest attack submarine in the world. Carries about 40 cruise missiles. A crap load of torpedoes, including probably the Shkval, which does 300 miles an hour underwater. Maybe not the most accurate torpedo, but a one-hit kill again. So even if the Russians lose one item per attack, right after that, everything becomes easy for them. So the emphasis on being able to take out NATO shipping with the SU-24s, for example, is a low-cost risk for the Russians. Why? Well, the SU-24s are cheaper than the SU-34s. They've got 1,500 of them out of the 6,000 that they've made. God knows how many they have just in mothballs. So you could basically just pour SU-24s at every aircraft carrier to water down the defenses. It's called cannon fodder, And while the aircraft carriers and destroyers are basically out of missiles, at that point in comes your SU-22s or TU-22Ms. You ask your SU-34s. At that point, it's just keep lopping missiles at them until their defense systems are out there. The flares, and not only that, at the same time, there probably would be a coordinated attack under the waves from Russian submarines. Remember, the Russian Navy is primarily consists of submarines. Submarines are kind of cruise missile proof. Submarines do have a lot of handicaps, such as they're quite sophisticated and require a highly trained crew to be able to use, but they're the ultimate in stealth. But however, where a submarine gives its position away is usually when it fires a weapon. So when you fire a weapon on a submarine, it has to be a kill shot. Otherwise, you give yourself away. And once the anti-submarine aircraft and helicopters and stuff like that get a whiff of the scent of a submarine, it's very hard for a submarine to slip away. Again, sonar being what it is. To sneak in up on a destroyer is very, very, very difficult. Oftentimes, in submarine warfare or even surface group warfare, they always know where the Russian submarines are, and the submarines always know where the surface group is. It's almost impossible for a ship on the top surface not to be detected. It's almost impossible. It makes too much of a wake, makes too much noise, that type of thing. So if you have aircraft coming in over the waves really low, you have aircrafts really high with anti-shipping missiles. Everything's coming all in at once at multiple angles with long-range missiles. It really does create the fish in a barrel effect that the Russians would want. So the thing is this is what they're training for, because they know the first line of defense that NATO is going to have is going to probably be, a surface group. Again, kind of that defense over the water. So when they're sending out their TU-22s, again, these things, they can fly low, they can fly fast, and they can carry a huge payload. It's very, very hard to detect aircraft that fast, and when you detect them, even if you know they're coming, you have a very short amount of time to respond to them. Plus, the TU-22 being a bomber does have a considerable range, not a phenomenal range, but they can play cat and mouse with a warship all day. Now, remember, last year from the making of this video, NATO had some incursions with the SU-24s. Getting a bit tongue-tied here, sorry about that. And the SU-24s basically not only circled American warships, the Donald Cook Ollibird class Aegis U.S. destroyer, it circled it 12 times, a pair of SU-24s. Canada had some really good photographs of Su-24s going around its flight decks on, I believe it was one of the Halifax class destroyers. I think it was the HMCS Toronto, uh, and the Su-24. But the Russians come out and they say hi. Let you know they're there. But the thing is that I don't know if it happened to the Canadian crew, but I do know what happened to the U.S. crew. They couldn't track these airplanes. Whatever radar jamming they were using on the Russian aircraft, they couldn't track these aircraft, and that was making it very discouraging for the crew. So maybe the Russians have a new tracking radar jamming techniques that with the Su-24, aka the bomb truck, is electronic warfare aircraft. So maybe they've come up with something that jams signals quite well. One of the things with the Su-27 lineup of aircraft, I still refer to them as the Su-27 lineup, but like the Su-35 and stuff like that, the most modern day variant, and of course the Su-T50. These airplanes, jam-proof radar was something that they worked on. Did they perfect it? Maybe yes, maybe no. What is jam-proof really? There's jam and counter jam. For example, one of the aircrafts that I thought was an insane idea for the Americans to mothball and not build a modern-day variant of was the A6 Intruder and Prowler. These aircraft, I mean, if you want to beat radar systems, that's the airplane you use. Particularly the Prowler had a crew of 4. And it was a bit of a bomb truck too. Yeah, there's other aircrafts that are probably better at it, but they could have built a modern version, an upgraded version of the Prowler. Again, why reinvent the wheel when you can just refine the wheel, right? Now, these Su-34s, a little more stealthy, but again, designed for good low-level attacks as well as, can be used in more of a bomber fighter, strike fighter role, even in an attack role. But one of the things that is really at home at is jamming radars and attacking shipping. It's basically the Su-24 or Su-34 was supposed to be the replacement for the Su-24. It's just the Su-24. There's so many of them, and take advantage of them, right? So the Russians have even though they've modernized a lot of their stuff, they still use a lot of old stuff that they've just kind of remodernized. Now these Su-24 24s are also being sold to Argentina. There's things are heating up there. Again, the Russians doing trade deals there. They're also I think a few other like Venezuela might be getting some. I don't know what's going to happen in Cuba yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if you've seen if you're in Florida, all of a sudden you're starting to see Russian aircraft probing the area on a regular basis. And this is something the Russians have said they're going to do starting in 2015, is doing more patrols in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, you play around in the Ukraine, well, the Russians will play around in your backyard. So, it's kind of like, see how you like it, The other thing, too, is that the airplanes that would be used as air superiority is obviously the Su-35s, which are in high enough numbers. And them being backed by MiG-29s. The MiG-29s are more going to be used to protect the air bases. Highly maneuverable, good short-range interceptors, what they are, And like most Russian fighters, they're brute power. I wouldn't say the Russian fighters are 100% better than American fighters. I think American fighters are still pretty darn good, like the F-15, the F-16. The F-16 is the agility of an F-16. Again, the better pilot wins. The thing you have to understand is, the air show tactics you see with the Su-27 and stuff, with the kill butt maneuver, known as the somersault, or the Cobra maneuver and all that stuff. That stuff is like last-ditched attempt. If you bled off all that speed on your aircraft, you're going to go into a stall, and every SU or MiG-29 goes into a slight stall right after the Cobra maneuver. And when it does, that's when you get killed. So you would never bleed off that much speed unless you knew again, it would be a desperation shot. This is one thing the RAF pilots have said in the Typhoon, said, those are fancy techniques that they're using, but if they did that in a dogfight, they would die. Because again, you bleed off that much speed that fast, then you better get the kill shot or you're going to be killed yourself, and it makes sense once you look at it like that. Brings us to the CF-18 and the FA-18 that the Americans have. One of the huge advantages of that airplane is the wing. The wing is designed to not only bleed off speed really quickly, but to have excellent low-speed handling. Now, is the CF-18 as maneuverable as the MiG-29? Under certain conditions, yes. You have to understand all the super maneuverability stuff of the MiG-29 or the Su-27s and Su-35s and all that have to take place below 200 miles an hour. If not, the pilot will just turn themselves into mush from the G-forces. So when we look at it like that, it really does change the dynamic of how these airplanes will actually be used in the real world. And when we look at things like the Frogfoot, for example, uh, that's going to be an attack aircraft. And there's lots of them. The Russians have lots of them. That's going to go after tanks, stuff like that. Again, it's a tank buster by nature. The Russians have enough of these that they could, probably overwhelm a navy, but they would be shot down in large numbers because, again, they're not that stealthy. They're not really designed to be, really high tech. Dog fighters. They're an attack aircraft. But the thing is the Russians have a lot of those, and they're reliable enough. So again, if you take out the shipping, like these NATO drills are for, when you take out the shipping, then you can then, and of course helicopters would be used, prowling the shorelines, getting ready to fire missiles at any sort of aircraft or anti-submarine helicopters or anything like that. And then, of course, if you have MiG-31s coming in on a high-speed strike, which they are mostly used as high-altitude interceptors and reconnaissance, but they also are used as fast payload strike bombers. Again, they have a long range, not that maneuverable, but at 80,000 feet, what's going to catch them? They don't even have to go super cruise at that distance. And at Mach 3 at 80,000 feet, nothing will catch them. Unless you're within missile firing range. And the envelope in which you get to shoot these airplanes down is, again, time becomes of the essence. So the problem with the destroyers and stuff like that, they have to be heavily protected by fighters. Again, to me, a ship is something that becomes a bit obsolete after a while because of the vulnerabilities of them. Although they are very advanced, the second you're out of countermeasures, you're dead. One destroyer captain put it well. He says, either we shoot down the missiles or we don't. Like that's the thing. Either you shoot them down or you don't. There's not enough warships. It's not like World War II where you had tens of thousands of warships. There's hardly any warships really left in the world. I think, in service, there might be 400 submarines. So the numbers get down very, very quick. But in aircraft, that's a different story. There's, probably a million aircraft flying worldwide combat-wise, maybe of different variations, close to a million anyway. So, again, I think in a conventional war, World War III won't last long. Let's put it to you this way. In World War II, the Luftwaffe started out with 2,500 aircraft at the beginning of the war. The RAF had about 700. Okay. By the end of the war, there was 30,000 of just about every variant of aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 had tens of thousands. The Me-109 in all variants was over 29,000 aircraft. The Russians held the record with the IL-58, 52, 58, with something like 40,000 or 90,000. It was just a ridiculous amount of aircrafts built. And Spitfires of almost 30,000 in all variants. So when we look at the modern RAF, or the modern RCAF, or even the US, really the numbers, you got about 500 F-15s, about 4,000 F-16s. Not all of them belong to the United States, but throughout the world. F-4 Phantoms, there was about 5,000 of those. Very few of them are flying now. Probably a couple of hundred. They're the budget airplane. If you don't want to buy a MiG-21, you buy an F-4 Phantom. I still say a Phantom's a pretty good airplane for today in a lot of ways, but it's its last service was in Desert Storm, I believe, or Desert Fox. One of those. It was in Iraq and Afghanistan where it was last used, and I think that was back in the 90s. But those days of the kind of more simplistic, quick-to-build aircraft are gone. An F-22 takes, forever to build. The F-35, they're a great airplane when they work. So the only airplanes that are really practical now are the F-16. The Super Hornet's still practical. Everything else, the F-15 is very practical. Again, stable airframe. Why reinvent the wheel? Just refine it, make a lighter F-15. That's more like the Silent Eagle is pretty cool, but again, low in numbers. There's only, I think, one or two, but the F-15, just work on that. You don't even have to change the airframe, just leave it stable. That's what keeps it a flyable airplane. And in one thing about the F-15 is that they are a tough airplane. There was an Israeli pilot. I don't know what happened to the airplane. I think it was an in-air collision, ripped off. I think it was the whole right wing of the airplane was ripped off, and the pilot was still able to land the airplane with like one wing gone. So that gives you an idea of, simple, reliable, and the F-15 is definitely powerful and very fast, but it's being outclassed by a lot of lighter fighters, newer fighters. So the F-15 doesn't really need to be replaced; it just needs to be upgraded, and just build some new ones. The F-22 would be okay if they were as practical as the F-15. F-22, again, kind of low in numbers, very advanced. I know some people say they're a lemon. They're not that bad. You just watch how they fly. They're that good. But when we're talking about fighter aircraft, we're really talking about the avionics. The software will outdo the hardware. Almost, if your fighter doesn't have a look down, shoot down system, you don't have a modern day fighter. And that's why the dogfight is kind of changed, where your airplane, you can shoot at it with the nose not even on the aircraft. So that is a huge advantage. So that makes it very, very difficult to shoot down airplanes without getting shot down yourself. And this is where the cat and mouse game comes in, and this is where I think the Russians have a huge advantage, particularly with things like SU-27 or modern variants of, is that they got a 2,700 mile range. One thing that the Iraqi pilots were doing is what they call the classic Soviet J, where they fly towards the enemy, and then as soon as the enemy turns into them, they turn away in like a J pattern, and then they turn back into them, and they probe back and forth about 5 or 10 times, and then once they finally make the attack, they'll go in. I don't think the Soviet pilots are as predictable as people think. You have a pilot with good training, he's going to be a force to be reckoned with, particularly at the controls of these type aircrafts. One thing though, the Americans have the most training, the best training. There's you might get for every one really good Russian pilot, you have probably 1,000 equally good American pilots. The training is where the Americans have the huge advantage. Is that they're second to none in the training. Canadian pilots, same thing. We have very few pilots, but they're phenomenal pilots. I mean, when you watch a Canadian pilot fly a CF-18, it's pretty impressive. Again, these guys, they fly 2,000 hours a year. Problem is you only have a handful of them. Now the Soviets, they might not have as many good pilots, but again, you send up 100 MiG-21s after one F-22. My money's on the MiG-21s. You know what I mean? Unless the F-22 bugs out. So this is the philosophy that the Russians still kind of use. They're trying to upgrade their stuff, and they are upgrading their stuff to be advanced and more advanced in some areas. But where they lack in advancement, they make up for in numbers, and that's where the surface groups will have the biggest problems. Because not only will they have to deal with waves of aircrafts coming in on a cat and mouse kind of game. Again, the SU-24s and the SU-22s, if they were coming in after shipping, and the SU-30s, which they're also using on this, sorry, getting a little dry there, you have to keep in mind that if they're sending in SU-30s to go out, which is a very advanced Russian fighter, it's a tandem seat, so it means you can have a weapons officer in the back. And if you have an SU-30 coming in after a NATO ship, remember the SU-30 can also backbone as a frontline fighter. The Indians use it. India has them. I think there's a few countries that use the SU-30. So you don't want to buy the SU-34, you don't want to buy the SU-35, you buy the SU-30, and that kind of gives you the best of both worlds. It's the intermediate compromise. And with the SU-30, one of the huge advantages with that is, again, long range, super maneuverable, very powerful, high altitude, high capabilities, good low level attack. You got the forward canards for low speed handling. It's a jack of all trades, and that would be a very hard aircraft to send in. And if those things were escorting the Su-24s, they could be used also as a extra radar jamming with the Su-24s. They could also be used to deliver more agility, to come in low over the waves, fire off its sea skimming missiles, and then away it goes. Again, you send out 100 aircraft, one missile hits the aircraft carrier or the air defense ship, the destroyer, then what? You know what I mean? So to me, and then of course, if we these old Oscar class submarines, a lot of them are being decommissioned, but if they're not all decommissioned yet, the Akula 2s, those type of thing. So you would have probably, I would think, the way the Russians would do this is attack everywhere all at once. You know, be everywhere. That has always been their philosophy, is to be everywhere, overwhelm with numbers. And again, if you're in somewhere like the Black Sea, you're in a big problem because the Black Sea, you're basically a fish in a barrel at that point. And we do know that the Russians have already staged their newest submarines near the Crimea area as well. So that means not only are there Russian submarines already in that area, they're doing drills, everything like that. NATO would be at a severe handicap being in those waters. It is a big body of water, but you might be able to get in there, but you might not be able to get out of there. And of course, with aircraft buzzing around, you know, it would be a turkey shoot in there. I think the only places surface groups can really work is out in the open ocean, you know, because then they could, you know, stay slightly out of range of a lot of aircraft. But the problem is Russians have long-range aircraft. You know, if we look at the average American aircraft, they're usually smaller, lighter, mid-capable aircraft such as F-16, F-18, that type of thing. You know, they typically have a 600-mile range, so you have to put so much the drop tanks and everything on them. The problem that you run into there is by the time you've got enough fuel to get to do what you want to do, you've only got 2 weapons, maybe 2 missiles, max 4 weapons on your aircraft, which doesn't give you a lot to do to, you know, counter enemy threats. Whereas something like an SU-35 or an SU-34 can have a drop tank and an additional 12 weapons, you know, so higher capability, right? So, and then of course, if underneath the wave you've got a Bori class boomer sub, which is loaded to the teeth with torpedoes, and followed by a Yazan class sub with cruise missiles, which, you know, could be subsurface to surface, basically coming out, shooting, you know, maybe 20 miles out, launches a very, you know, fast, you know, cruise missile. At the same time, missiles are coming in from the air. So basically, you can overwhelm a ship very quickly. And even if you only get one ship at a time, again, that cat and mouse game can go on for days, particularly with submarines. It can go on for days, where it's just, okay, well, we'll get in close fire missile. They shot that one down. But you know, once the shooting starts, they just keep shooting until somebody hits it. Again, you're 100 miles out, firing in missiles, and then all of a sudden, when the ship fires back missiles, you know, again, every missile that the ship fires, for example, the Canadian destroyer only carries 29 like harpoons and stuff like that. Now it carries the Gatling guns and stuff like that, you know, tens of thousands of rounds to be able to shoot down. You know, they have the Sea Sparrow and stuff like that. But the problem with that, even with the main gun and all that, once you're out of countermeasures, you're sitting duck. You have no way to defend your ship. And if you're stuck in a body of water that there's only really one way in, one way out, that has a bunch of eagles, you know, hovering above it with cruise missiles, you could see the disaster that is ready to happen. And the Russians are training for that. Now, on the other side, what they're doing is they're also getting ready with the missile forces and stuff like that. And recently, you know, Putin has come out and said, look, I don't think the Ukraine will turn into a bloodbath or apocalyptic scenario at this time, but, you know, Poroshenko should really push for the, you know, to make the peace deal work. So you take out of that what you want. Now, the other thing that they also said, too, was that there was nothing that NATO had that the Russians couldn't counter. And I'm kind of inclined to believe them. That I'm not saying they wouldn't take losses. Of course they would take losses. And that's what the Russians would be counting on, is that the cost is so great to go to war with them. It doesn't matter if they win or lose. It's just the cost is too great. Would Europe pay that price? You know, I mean, it would annihilate half of Europe, or 3/4 of it, you know. So this is what I think Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel are kind of on that tightrope about. Yeah, they would like to support the states, and they're kind of, Germany particularly, being slightly, you know, kind of controlled by, you know, the U.S. In the sense that, you know, business-wise, you know, they kind of have to go along to get along. But you can see that they're not jumping into you know, the anti-Russian war hoop that the U.S. wants. You know, a lot of times, you know, Angela Merkel's out there talking about Okay, well, we can do sanctions, but let's be careful with them. Francois Hollande saying, well, maybe sanctions aren't the best idea. So again, these people, they know what's going on. They know that what it would cost in Europe. And you've had Francois Hollande a few times saying, we don't want an apocalyptic nightmare in Europe. We don't want to be at war with the Russians. The Russians have also, again, the Russians love them or hate them. It doesn't really matter. One of the things you have to keep in mind is when they do tell you something, they're usually not bluffing. They may lie to you left, right, and center, but when they tell you something, they're not kidding. And one of the things they said, look, you push us too far, we could have our tanks in Paris in a week, less than a week. And I do believe that what Putin is going to do at some point is call NATO's bluff. The Crimea is never going to be in the hands of anybody other than the Russians, so to speak. Remember, and I'm going to do a video on a recap of the, 1 year after the Maidan massacre in Ukraine, and my thoughts on it. I'm sure a lot of people don't agree with me on a lot of stuff, but there's some things, you can't deny. I mean, it's openly admitted, stuff like that. And of course, we see how things are shaping up there, and they're not really turning out the way the EU, the IMF, and the US wanted the Ukraine to turn out. But maybe they did. Maybe they want a proxy war in there to destabilize, so Russia can't take advantage of the Ukraine for the labor, for the food, stuff like that. And again, we see the sanctions that are actually hurting Europe. Again, boomerang effect, hurting Europe almost as much or more than it is Russia in a lot of ways. And Russia can sit this one out, they can, they've got room to play. And the Russian people are backing Putin like crazy. Now, does he have an 80 or 85% approval rating? Probably not, but he's probably got the highest rating of any, president in history next to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, I think, was the record holder with 57%. You remember, for anybody to have a 40% approval rating, a prime minister or anything like that is like phenomenal. Okay, here in Canada, Harper is 33 to 34% is his approval rating, so he's actually doing not too bad. Obama, how do you put this nicely? Single digit numbers aren't that bad. Well, anyway, hey, look, a bunny. And run away. There we go. But anyway, you get the idea. The people in the States, I feel bad for the people in the States because they're going to be held accountable for the actions of lunatics in Washington. And when you listen to the rhetoric in Washington, and I think this is what European countries are kind of waking up to, it's like they're all gung-ho for a war with Russia. But the thing is you have to understand, from Washington to the doorstep of Europe, the people in Europe are looking at it and saying, hey, if there's a war, it's going to be fought not in my backyard, but on my doorstep. That changes things. Europe has already seen what a massive modern day war looks like with World War II, World War I, that type of thing. They don't want that, and people that may have been gung ho over it, say yeah, we want to overthrow the Russians. They're looking at the Ukraine and saying, hey, you know what? That's what Europe could look like, is Eastern Ukraine right now. Do we really want that? And I don't think many people do, especially when the fight is basically been picked. I wouldn't say unprovoked, but because again, we have to remember, over the Crimea, like I said right a year ago, after the Maidan massacre, that this would be Putin's line in the sand, and I'm pretty confident I call that one pretty good, because here's the deal: the Russians already had the influence in Ukraine. They already pretty much had full control of the government there, corrupt or not, it doesn't matter. They had control of it. So there was no reason for them to really do a coup, because they already had control of it. Where the coup came from, and this is pretty much admitted by George Soros and the State Department, the redhead there, Paskey, Jen Paskey, pretty much tells you what happened there. And of course, Victoria Nuland, baking her cookies and giving it to the Maidan protesters, which they no longer support, basically, saying how they did the coup. George Soros saying how much money they put into this coup in the past 20 years. And when we look at the Sochi Olympics, I think the Russians knew why they got the Olympics, and that was to be the distraction while the coup was taking place. Now, the Russians probably knew this was coming. Again, we had, I think it was in 2010, a U.S. Politician saying, we're going to have a trouble with the Crimea around 2013, 2014. How would he know this? exactly how would he know this that far in advance, unless he were setting something up? Even the Polish prime minister had come out at one point saying, "Look, the Americans are giving it to us up the butt, and they don't even have the decency to give us a reach around." You know what I mean? He says, they're going to get us into a war on their doorstep. We have all kinds of NATO activity in Poland right now. And I think, well, Poland's committed one way or another. It doesn't really matter if they want to do it or not. And I don't think Poland wants to go toe to toe with the Russians. I mean, again, the cost would be just way too high. Whether they like them or not is not the issue. It's what is the cost going to be. The Russians will not back down. The Russians have clearly showed that they not only do they call Obama's bluff, but they view the United States so corrupt and weak. Now, I know that statement will tick off a lot of American viewers of mine, but that's how they view it. They know that they can basically push Obama around like crazy because he's like a wet fish, right? He just flip flops. So he says one thing, and this is this is why I say you're going to see the Russians test NATO at some point, and a really obvious test. My prediction is when the Russians have had enough, they will test. They've already tested nuclear missiles, ballistic missiles like crazy last year. It was a record year for that. It's been a record year. 2014 was a record year for military drills in size worldwide, pretty much all nations, Canada included. Even though the Canadian one might not be considered that impressive, but it was our largest. We did some of our largest drills. Now the Russians have done the missile tests. They have done the warhead tests. The next stage is simple: detonate a warhead. Say we were just upgrading, and because they said they were upgrading their nuclear arsenal. So the next stage is, okay, we're going to set off a nuke. I predict an atmospheric test of some sort, just so it gets the attention. That's what the Russians will want. They will want the world to see this, because they don't care what the world thinks of them. They don't care about the outrage. What they want is the world to see it, and then say, what I would predict is that they would probably do it in a region which the Europeans would notice it by getting a small EMP in an area, knocking out power, saying, "Oh, much very sorry. We didn't realize it was that big. That could probably annihilate the whole continent. Did you notice too? Sorry about the power. It'll be back in 1 week's time. Have a nice day. Again, did you notice how big it was? Checkmate." That's what's going to happen. Then after that, Putin plays the crazy man, kind of like North Korea style, where it's the United States, every time they do something in the Ukraine, whether it's deliver non-lethal aid, as so far that's what Canada's been doing, but non-lethal aid is lethal aid. A red dot system on a rifle is lethal aid. That red dot, allows you to kill things a lot faster. It is a game changer over iron sights like you wouldn't believe. So you can call it non-lethal aid, but it's lethal aid. Night vision goggles is lethal aid. It's a passive version of the lethal aid, but again, it allows you to get the job done. So the Russians, every time you send an EOTech to put on Ukrainian soldiers' AK, the Russians send in a T-72. Are you getting the picture here? They're swatting flies with sledgehammers is what they're doing. The response is 10 times over the top of what, because the Russians, that's how they're calling the bluff. So again, we'll have to wait to see what happens in the spring offensive. If the spring offensive is to happen, which I'm thinking they're going to be, if it doesn't happen, there will be rogue elements in the Ukraine doing it, i.e. the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector guys, parts of the Ukrainian military, which want to get, they have to take Mariupol, according to the Ukrainian military, they have to take Mariupol before they can get into the Crimea. But the Crimea is that's where the fireworks are going to start. Why? The Russian Navy is not giving up that port, period. It's not going to happen. And again, we see the Russians getting ready for attacks on NATO ships. So if the Russians can control the Baltics and they can control the Black Sea, after that, it's going to be pretty hard to get into Russia. And, if they control particularly the Black Sea, there will probably, I would imagine, Turkey would not have a choice in this, but they would probably be setting up on in Turkey, and basically nothing from Europe would be able to get past that. And then on the other hand, on the Baltics, well, if they control the Baltics, you're going to have some pretty nervous Swedes over there, but I think they'll do fine as long as they're not a part of NATO, so it doesn't mean they wouldn't have to jump to defend themselves, but Again, I think the countries that will probably get crushed in a Soviet uprising, so to speak, would be anything along the border of Russia. Hungary, maybe the people might not be for it, but it looks like they're going to go along more with the Russian side of things. I'm pretty sure Serbia will go along with the Russians. And Latvia and Estonia, it's hard to say. Estonia, I'm pretty sure they're pretty nervous right now. Again, and again, all these countries are saying, whoa, they're looking at this saying, the Americans are pushing for war, but we're going to have to fight it, or we're going to get crushed, that type of thing. So this is why I'm thinking that this could break up NATO. If I don't think the NATO alliance is as strong as people think it is, and that is a big problem for many countries, particularly the UK. I'm not too sure, but I think they can see into Russia pretty good from their view. Again, they would be hit very fast, very quickly. Again, the RAF does. Again, the Eurofighter Typhoon, awesome airplane. The Tornado, awesome airplane. I've seen them up close. Well, I haven't seen the Typhoon up close, but I've seen. I've been in a Tornado, not flying, but at air shows, I've jumped into them and stuff like that. And I realized the capabilities of the Tornado. It's a good airplane, but too low numbers. Harrier. Again, spent a lot of time jumping into the cockpit of a Harrier at the Aviation Museum when I used to work there. Loved it. It was awesome. But again, pulling those things out of mothballs, having them ready, and again, the limitations they have, their short range. Again, unlike World War II, the English Channel might not provide the cover, particularly with the Russians, because they can kind of just roll into the UK. So they don't get that advantage this time, and this is where numbers will count. And like anything, if you don't have anybody on your side to jump to your aid, or just a little too far away, or not enough, i.e. NATO members. Right now, I think there's only 2 countries that actually met their 2% of GDP for NATO. I forget what country it was, but anyway, it was near the region. But even at that, again, the numbers are just, Russia's training to take on the entire of NATO. That's always been their goal. They do realize NATO is expanding. They do realize NATO is at their door. But they also, they make people start spending money on NATO. Next thing you know, you got Russian bombers buzzing your border, kind of reminding you, well, while you're putting money into NATO, this is what you're putting it into. We'll be there. We know you're doing it. And it is a form of, it's a pissing contest. It's a form of intimidation. Now, the thing is can the Russians intimidate? Well, of course they can. They've got good aircraft, maybe American airplanes might have a few technical advantages over the Russians, but the numbers are the numbers, And the home advantage of the Russians, again, over Europe, Russians have resources. Europe doesn't have as many resources as Russia, fuel and stuff like that. So, mobile infantry for Russia is again, it matches NATO. So, for the NATO countries that are not as well off as the Russians, they're going to do one massive sweep. They're not going to go after one country at a time. But the countries that they would take out first would be, should it come to it, would be the UK, would be Germany, would be France, would be, the big hitters, all the big hitters in the area. And if they took out those 3, everybody else folds. Why? Because, they're not suicidal, right? So I'm thinking when we see these drills, and we see, again, we've seen the strategic warfare drills. Again, Russian military commanders saying, yes, our strategic nuclear forces, mobile forces can respond within seconds to any nuclear threat. Sorry, getting dry again. Meaning that should they detect a nuclear launch, they would have missiles in the air within seconds. Which, considering that Topol-M takes less than 3 minutes to set up, if it's already kind of sitting there waiting, launch the missile is just, it's seconds, maybe minutes at most. And then from there, the world, from the launch of the first weapon to the launch of the last weapon, you're talking about a battle that lasts max an hour and a half, max. That's if somebody has to go and take a dump before they launch the missile. You know what I mean? That's the kind of situation we're in. Should it not go nuclear? Again, all the technical stuff, the warships, the fighter jets, The technical advanced stuff, I think, lasts max 2 weeks, including the Russian stuff. But the low level stuff, after all the F-22s have been shot down, after all the SU-35s and SU-34s and stuff like that have been shot down in the Typhoons, then you're going on second line, third line fighters. That's when you see things like Frogfoots and MiG-21s make a reappearance, and the simple numbers. And then, of course, Hind helicopters. Even if they get shot down in large numbers, it doesn't matter. There's enough of them that they can overwhelm. And then, of course, you have, between the T-80 and the T-72s, well, minimum you're looking at, again, the Russians built, 17,000 T-72s. Even if they sold more than half of them off, you're looking at at least 16,000 tanks between the two. And the T-80 and the T-72, even in original variation, are still decent enough to get the job done. Yeah, you'd lose a lot of them, but again, they factor that into the cost. That yes, we'll take losses as we're gearing up with high tech stuff. We have enough low tech stuff to kind of use as cannon fodder. Again, in the tens of thousands, right? If they were just to use T-55 tanks, they built 95,000 of those. Again, the Russians never put serial numbers on stuff, so we don't know how much they have of anything. There's like 6,000 Frogfoots. Maybe they only keep 500 of them in, or 1,500 of them going. But the mothball stuff, I mean, they've even the stuff in mothballs that can't fly anymore is still an aircraft of spare parts. I mean, look, a country buys a MiG-21, even though a MiG-21 is kind of outclassed by most modern-day fighters for sure. You buy one MiG-21 to fly and 8 of them for parts. You know what I mean? And you probably get them all under $1 million. So maybe 4 million with upgrades. So, I mean, you get the idea. And then, of course, the helicopters. One thing about the Russians is they do understand the value of the helicopters. After the Vietnam War, one of the things they realized was how valuable the Huey was, and they really put a lot of effort into their attack helicopters after that. And of course, the Black Shark helicopter, outstanding helicopter. Is it as good as the Apache? I'd put my money on the Apache, but still, it's a good helicopter in a lot of ways that the Apache isn't, and the Apache's good in a lot of ways that the other isn't. MiG-29, excellent airplane, period. Again, it's more going to come about the man than the machine. And then, of course, there's just the regular forces. Again, how will the Russians fight? It's hard to see how they fight. The Grad launchers, there's like 40,000 of those things. Yeah, they're completely inaccurate, but they're, if you want to just bombard a city, just to be a nuisance to them, that's what you use. And again, 40,000. Maybe you get lucky. Who cares? There's enough of them. They're expendable. Cannon fodder. That's what the Russians have. And that's what they plan on using. It's a win big, lose big kind of scenario for them. So they're never going to give up on their ideology. Now, the thing is, are they the good guys or are they the bad guys? Well, you can't look at it good guy, bad guy. You have to look at it as superpowers fighting for hegemony. That's what it is. Now, technically, the Russians aren't an expanding empire in the same way the United States is, where the United States is pretty much, using democracy to destroy the entire Middle East and control all the resources. Well, the Russians are doing it, a different way, like basically through blackmail and stuff like that. So Putin, a good guy, a bad guy, he's a puppet like anybody else. Is he more nationalistic? Yes. Is he more for the traditional family? Yes. Is he more patriotic than Obama? Hands down. So there are likable things for the Russians for Putin. Yes. Is he corrupt as every other Russian politician that came before him? Yes. So again, he's kind of like a James Bond supervillain. But at that, his handlers are a hell of a lot more focused, less. They're more chess playing kind of quality than Obama's checker playing, State Department. I mean, whoever controls Obama at the top is a lunatic and very, very indecisive. Russians, you can't say that they're indecisive. They know what they want, they know what they're going to go after, and they know how they're going to get it, and they usually plan like 200 years in advance. So, these guys, they're not dumb, and when it comes to the military thing, they're definitely ready, and they're showing us that they're ready. And again, when Putin calls NATO's bluff, it's going to be something that the world is going to notice, and that will probably be the demise of NATO at that point, because there's no way Europeans want another war, because this won't be like World War II. This will be a very fast war. The pace at which a war can be fought nowadays, even with just conventional weapons. Again, we're no longer talking about Spitfires and Hurricanes and Focke-Wulfs and 190s and Me-109s. We're talking about aircraft that travel twice the speed of sound with missiles that fire up to 600 miles to 1,600 miles away. Yeah, so you get the idea. So anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. So that's what's kind of going on. If you like this kind of content, please consider making a donation to help support the channel, being viewer supported and all that, and help get better content and all that good stuff. Rate, subscribe, share, definitely share, comment. Take advantage of the comments. That's what they're there for. So do that. So be true to yourself, be true to others, and always do the right thing. G'day, hi, and welcome. Okay, let's get into this. Well, looks like the Russians are doing some drills, basically using SU-30, SU-24s. I can imagine probably SU-34s and Tu-22s. Basically staging simulated attacks on NATO shipping in the Baltic Sea. Or not the Baltic Sea, in the Black Sea. So the thing is that even though NATO isn't in the Black Sea, but the thing is, or are they? Yeah, they are. But anyway, sorry, I'm kind of Friday, kind of all over the map here. But anyway, they're doing this training drills. And I don't know why NATO gets so offended when they do this, considering all the drills that NATO does to counter Russian stuff. So the thing is that this is kind of, again, going back to something that actually one of my commenters made about the RAF with the Typhoons and being used in conjunction with warships. I forget which warship the British have. Basically a destroyer. Almost the same kind of role Canada would use our destroyers in. Our aircraft destroyers and ship destroyers, basically the Iroquois. We only have the 3 tribal class destroyers left, but only one is in the Athabascan is the only one that I know of that's in service. And it has basically air defense systems on it that if you had basically the Aurora CP-140 flying basically sub-hunter, electronic warfare type of thing, flying around. Above that, you would have the CF-18s circling to protect the Auroras. The Auroras would also help to protect the CF-18s by jamming radar signals and stuff like that. And of course, the surface group would be down there with the Kingston class doing mine sweeping and basically, look, sub-hunting. And then of course you'd have the frigates, which also would be sub-hunting, the Halifax class, and then the destroyer class, which would be doing all those things as well as more emphasis on air defense. So it's to be used as a group. Now, the Russians know this, and this is pretty much what a British citizen, pretty much one of my commenters described to me what the RAF would do with the British Typhoon would fly cap and then protecting the destroyers, and they would pretty much use the same tactics as Canada in that sense. Most people do, militaries do. And plus you'd have your submarines below the surface on top of that. So everybody's kind of working together as one unit. So the thing is one thing the Russians have is they have 2 types of aircraft that really kind of come into play when we're talking about anti-shipping. The Su-22M and the Su-34. These are aircrafts that are pretty much designed specifically to be ready to take out aircraft carriers, surface groups, that type of thing. It's not the only things they have. The reason why they'd use those is that, number one, the Tu-22s are a mid-weight bomber, basically similar to that of what would be the U.S. equivalent. Maybe not quite as powerful as the B-1 Lancer, but in that kind of territory. Heavy payload, cruise missiles, that type of thing. And remember, with the cruise missile technology out there, you don't have to get right above the ship to bomb it. These things might be firing sea skimming missiles as far as 100 miles out. That's considered close range, right? So when you have a Tu-22 coming in over Mach 2, 20 feet off the, 20 feet wet, I mean, that's going to be a really hard aircraft to stop. And if there's multiple of them coming at different angles, well, look at the Russians are probably looking at it like this. Yes, there's a good chance that the surface group will shoot down all Tu-22Ms and Su-34s. But if one gets through, one cruise missile gets through, that's all it takes. You destroy 300 to 500 people in a big fireball. And if you take out a destroyer, then your nation that you're attacking has lost a major defensive asset. So that's why destroyers and aircraft carriers, which I think, this is going to be a bold statement, but they are becoming slightly obsolete. And here's why. Because the Russians have Mach 10 Mach 7 and Mach 10 anti-shipping missiles, which, believe it or not, most of them probably can be intercepted and shot down and countermeasured against. But it's a one-hit wonder. The Russians will launch basically from their Nunchukas or some of their other cruisers or whatever they have. They'll or even the Oscar class submarines. They could basically fire 24 missiles at a time. Only one has to get through. And if one gets through, again, after that, losing that kind of an air defense capability, you're then reliant on fighters pretty much and the ground defense radar. So basically, your early warning system out in the ocean somewhere, or in the Baltic Sea, or in the the Black Sea, or wherever you're going to be, is basically going to be easy ground to cover for Russian probing submarines. The Yassin class submarine is a attack submarine that the Russians have recently commissioned. I think they're going to put out 6 of these suckers, and these things are extravagantly. These things are claimed to do 40 knots underwater. It will be the fastest attack submarine in the world. Carries about 40 cruise missiles, a crap load of torpedoes, including probably the Shkval, which does 300 miles an hour underwater. Maybe not the most accurate torpedo, but a one-hit kill again. So even if the Russians lose one item per attack, right after that, everything becomes easy for them. So the emphasis on being able to take out NATO shipping with the SU-24s, for example, is a low-cost risk for the Russians. Why? Well, the SU-24s are cheaper than the SU-34s. They've got 1,500 of them out of the 6,000 that they've made. God knows how many they have just in mothballs. So you could basically just pour SU-24s at every aircraft carrier to water down the defenses. It's called cannon fodder, And while the aircraft carriers and destroyers are basically out of missiles, at that point in comes your SU-22s or TU-22Ms. You ask your SU-34s. At that point, it's just just keep lopping missiles at them until their defense systems are out there. The flares, and not only that, at the same time, there probably would be a coordinated attack under the waves from Russian submarines. Remember, the Russian Navy is primarily consists of submarines. Submarines are kind of cruise missile proof. Submarines do have a lot of handicaps, such as they're quite sophisticated and require a highly trained crew to